and today we're looking at protecting and monitoring the virtualization infrastructure. So like I've mentioned a few times already, like when you get a job, when you work in the workplace, you won't be building infrastructure, you won't be designing servers, you won't be setting up new infrastructure on a day-to-day basis. Most of the time, what you'll be doing is working with existing infrastructure, making sure that everything's performing well and maintaining that uptime, that all-important uptime that we're talking about. Okay, so basically this feeds onto that. Ability to just monitor problems as before they occur or before they become serious problems, as well as recovering from disasters or from problems if we do have in fact some issues. So today what we're going to do is look at protecting virtualization infrastructure by using Data Protection Manager. Sorry, what did you say there, Matthew? I missed that quick. I was talking, I missed that window. All right, no worries, Matthew. So if you do what you have to do, and we'll play it by ear as far as anything like that happens. Okay. All right, let's continue on. So, like I said, we're going to look at Data Protection Manager. We sort of mentioned this in our 5IC. Yep. Sorry.
Sorry, I just interrupted you. So I thought it was going great. All of a sudden, I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. I thought you had a question. That's okay. So we looked at data. We didn't look at it in the sense we used it. We discussed it in the 5ICW, and Data Protection Manager is another is something else that we're going to mention today. And there's also Operation Manager for monitoring and reporting, as well as integrating VMM with Operation Manager. But in our lab, you'll see that we'll use the Microsoft Windows Backup as our protection or the data recovery mechanism. So DPM, so if you don't remember that, that's a system center tool. It's Data Protection Manager. So as opposed to the Windows Backup, which backs up individual machines one at a time, et cetera, the DPM is a centralized, as the name suggests, data protection manager. So effectively, you can manage all the data protection needs of all your entire network from the one spot. So from a virtualization infrastructure point of view, it actually provides the following features. It allows us to back up multiple Hyper-V hosts and virtual machines from a single application. So you'll see in today's lab that it will be doing the backup on a per Hyper-V basis, but with the DPM, we'll be able to do it from the single location on multiple Hyper-Vs. It provides disaster recovery by replicating protected data to secondary offsite locations. Okay, so that's the backup information. So just imagine you did that Windows backup, but instead of once you've stored it on a local storage somewhere, it's also replicating that to a offsite location. That offsite location can be your offsite location, but it could also be a public a cloud location that's provided by a company like Microsoft Azure or AWS. Protection of the workloads such as SharePoint, Active Directory services, SQL Server, Exchange Server, Windows operating systems. So basically, it can protect all of these services as well. So not just protecting your data as far as your files, but the services, the databases that's part of these services, which is probably the most important thing. We've already, I think you guys would have already completed that CMDB, the data subject, as well as you might have realized that in the in the SCCM, in the Exchange, in the VMM here, we always seems to have a backend database server. So all of that is storing all those important bits of information out of those services, including the configuration and as well as many other bits of data. So that is very important. It's protected. So it can be used, like I said, to backups to the cloud services with Azure Online Backup. It has enhanced reporting so that you can actually, part of your backup strategy, if you remember, was actually testing of your backup. But this enhanced reporting will allow you to report on those testing that might have been done. It's scriptable using PowerShell. It supports the CSV cluster shared volumes and the virtual machine stored on SMB-free file shares. So if we have a look at the picture of how DPM can allow us to protect our virtualization infrastructure. So let's have a look at this diagram. So we've got Hyper-V hosts, okay, with virtual machines running on them, as we know. But there's also these agents. So if you've done the SCCM subject with me, you would know that agents are little bits of software that's installed into these computers that allows us to send instructions as well as receive information from these computers. And you can see there's an agent that's on the Hyper-V host itself, and there's agents that can be installed inside of each of the virtual machine. So it's called the DPM protection agent. But if you want an example of an agent that you're more familiar with, so if you remember VMware tools, that effectively is a agent, or yeah, so it's an agent, as in it's a piece of software that's installed inside the virtual machine that allows it to communicate with the host by sharing clipboards, sharing folders, doing all those things that we've become used to. So with these agents installed, deployed onto these Hyper-V and the virtual machines, they can report back and take instructions to the DPM server, which again, funny enough, we were just talking about databases, has a backend database. So with the DPM, we have a central console. So that's, like I said, DPM is a system center tool, just like System Center Configuration Manager is a System Center tool, just like the VMM, the Virtual Machine Manager, is a System Center tool. And there's many other System Center tools, but effectively, whenever we talk about System Center tools, it really means it's a very large network. It's a very large network with like hundreds, if not thousands, of servers, machines, resources. So therefore, instead of actually performing backup or configuring backup per server, one here, one here, one here, just like what we learned in 5RCW, that's where we learned about performing individual backups on each of the servers. So that's fine for a smaller company and even some medium-sized companies. But when you get big enough, and with a rapidly changing environment, dynamic environment, especially when you have virtual machines which are getting spun up, and new ones getting spun up, and old ones being retired and decommissioned, that these things change all the time. And with data protection or backups in general, you don't want to be caught short on the day where something happens. So just imagine the day that something actually happens, but you had new servers spin up, and also old servers go offline, and then you didn't configure the backups, or the backups didn't happen. So with the central console, we can manage multiple DPM servers. Okay, so multiple DPM servers, and we can then configure the data protection across the board. There's the components of DPM. So DPM components, the disaster recovery, secondary DPM server. We have the DPM server with the backend database. Then we have a secondary DPM server if its network is big enough. And with the DPM, we can link it up to Azure. So if you remember, we said that we can back up to the cloud. And obviously that is to replace the offsite backup component that you would have in your backup strategy. Okay, so why physically move something to another site just so you can have a offsite component of your backup strategy, when these days with the advent of the cloud, it's so much easier just to replicate or synchronize or backup, send the backups to the cloud as part of the process. Deploying protection agents. So like I said, the agents are those little bits of software that sits inside of the various components like the Hyper-V, the virtual machines, etc. So deployment protection agents, so we can actually do a couple of ways. We can deploy it. We can choose the installation method. That could be manual or automatic. Okay, so if you've done those, if you've done the SCCM subject with me, you'll realize that if you remember, we deployed the SCCM agent, and we can deploy the data protection manager agent in a similar way. We need to configure the firewall rules. Obviously, if these agents are to work to communicate back to the DPM servers, as well as send information such as the backups or disaster recovery information back to the DPM server, the firewalls must allow it. Okay, as we all know, we can deploy the agent via the DPM console, or we can deploy the agent manually. Configuring protection groups. So protection groups are a collection of data sources or members. The group that group together the following configuration settings. So data protection methods such as disk, tape, and cloud. Okay, so that's how you're going to protect it. You could protect it to disk or backup tapes or the cloud. If you remember, we talk about retention, data retention. So if we have a government policy, like for example, TAFE-SA as lecturers or as TAFE-SA RTO, registered training organization, we need to keep your assessments, your student assessments, your records, and everything else that's part of you studying for at least 18 months. So if that's the regulatory requirements of our company or of our industry, then our backups or our data protection must also complement that. So therefore, there's no point configuring a data retention of 12 months when we need to keep it for 18 months, if you know what I mean. Then there's the synchronization frequency. So how often it's synchronized. The consistency checks. This is like testing your the backup to see if it's actually backed up correctly. And then the recovery points. Okay, we can actually in a similar way to taking snapshots, we can configure recovery points, and we can effectively snapshot our data or our information. And then there's the compression. Okay, compression is obviously make it smaller so we can send this information across to wherever we're storing it a lot quicker and utilize less bandwidth. Options for protecting virtualization infrastructure. So backup options for server virtualization infrastructure includes host level backups that may include item level recovery. So this is talking about at the host using the Microsoft backup and using the item level items. Remember how we can manually select the items, and we can actually, which will allow us to recover individual items as well. It can be online or offline, subject to in-guest operating system versions. So what that means is that you can leave the virtual machines online while you're protecting them, or they might have to go offline. But that depends on the actual guest operating system and the version they have. So obviously, Microsoft, the latest version of Microsoft operating systems, will allow that online. But depending on the versions of if it's a Linux virtual machine or some other odd virtual machine with a different operating system, depends on the version, you may have to switch them offline before you can configure the backup. Performing virtual machine recovery, so virtual machine recovery considerations. So consider the virtual machine recovery location and make sure that there's adequate space. So when we're talking about virtual machines, they're huge, aren't they? Especially production ones. So if you're trying to restore a virtual machine to a location and that location doesn't have enough area, then you obviously can't restore it. Ensure that the performance of any systems during the restore does not impact the end user. So if you're restoring to a location or to a server that has actually got very busy virtual machines already running on it, then you're adding that extra load, not just the load of actually putting this recovered virtual machine and turning it on this server, but the load of actually the recovery process. If that actually impacts the user performance, then that's obviously something you have to understand and either accept or not accept. And if you don't accept it, then you need to find a different way of restoring it or a different location. So ensure recover virtual machines maintain desired security level. So obviously anything so we spend a lot of time securing our files, securing our services with firewall or ACLs and permissions and so forth. But at the end of the day, when we actually take a backup of either that data or virtual machine or virtual hard disk, they contain that important data, don't they? And if we don't treat them or store them in a secure location, then it's basically all that work of securing and assigning permissions and ACLs is just basically wasted. So do not recover or leave virtual machine hard disks in insecure locations. Okay, let's keep on going. So operation masters, operation manager. So for those of you who've done the SCCM with me, you'll recognize this specifically, looking like a SCCM tool. But it's a system center tool, you're right. Okay, so it's a system center tool, and basically from here we can monitor the workings of our virtualization infrastructure. So right now on this picture, for example, you have 0 critical alerts, which is good, 1 warning, and 3 healthy computers. So 1 with a warning. So that's something that we can actually explore a little bit later. But this is more of a dashboard look, so which gives you a lot of simple information quickly. And basically from here we can actually look at the monitoring. But you can see there's many other things we can do with it as well. So overview of the management packs. Management packs contain settings used to monitor specific applications or devices. Management packs can include monitors, rules, views, knowledge, tasks, reports, and run as profiles. So basically, we're talking about these kind of things. And obviously, alerts. We've got alerts which is pre-configured, but we can also configure our own alerts as well. Integrating VMM with operation managers. So operation managers integration with VMM. Basically, by doing this, you provide advanced monitoring and reporting. So if you remember, this is the operation managers, and it gives us all that reporting and monitoring features. It also gives us pro tips, so basically recommendations, like a best practice advice. It also gives us diagram views of the virtualization environment, and basically what that is just, it's almost like a network diagram, but it will show you how the virtual machines and what resources they're connected, like which host, which storage, and so which network, and those resources which is associated with the virtual machine. And then from that, it's a graphical look and a graphical way of determining what resources are common to certain virtual machines, or what resources are being used and what resources obviously is not being used. So what are pro tips? So pro tips are management packs with monitors that can react to events and remediate against them in VMM. So these are pre-configured actions or reactions to certain events. So certain events will trigger an alert, and the alert will trigger these actions. For example, you can configure a hardware pro tip to migrate virtual machines from the host when a disk fails. Okay, so that's just an example. So that's an automated action that if it detects that something like that has happened by triggering alert, it will trigger this reaction by migrating or using the live migration, the virtual machine from the host when a disk fails. And you're probably wondering, how can you migrate the host from how can you migrate the virtual machine from the host if the disk fails? Obviously, this is not necessarily the disk where the virtual machine is stored. And obviously, we've been talking about shared storage, so the virtual machines wouldn't be stored on the local disk anyway. And configuring advanced monitoring for virtual machine, it's We can import management packs for hardware and software components. So basically allows us to manage the hardware, monitor the hardware as well as the software. And we can use the Fabric Health dashboard and diagram views to actually give us quick information of your virtualization infrastructure. All right, so that is the end of the course officially.